Welcome to part 7 of the Civil War. Now we're going to talk about Antietam and the Emancipation Proclamation. Anytime you take a look at a nation at war, you have to take a look at what their conditions of victory are. What really marks whether or not they were successful or not. Now, for the Confederacy, their conditions of victory were pretty much the same as what the American colonists were in the American Revolutionary War. There were 3 criteria for victory for the South. Number 1, maintain an army in the field. Don't let your army get destroyed, right? Keep up the fight. Number 2, break the enemy's will to fight. Get the North to give up. Make them decide this is just not worth it, right? And number 3, get help, right? And the Confederacy is going to try and get help. They're going to try and get help through recognition. You got to get Europe, somebody in Europe, in this case specifically Great Britain, right, to recognize the Confederate States of America. If you can get one of these European nations to do this, then you can negotiate trade, you can maybe purchase arms, or maybe even get troops to help. This is what happened with the colonists in negotiating a treaty with France, right? And so their first attempt going to do that is actually going to lead to an incident that almost played right into the Confederacy's hands. The Confederate delegates were on board a British ship called the Trent. This ship was actually overtaken by an American ship, an American U.S. Navy ship, and the Confederate delegation was pulled off. Well, this was an international incident, and the British were quite offended with it. And William Seward even went so far as like, well, fine, we'll just fight the British over it. And Lincoln told him, says, let's fight one war at a time, please, right? He's going to smooth things over. The British were really torn on whether or not they should recognize the Confederate States of America, because the problem that they had was, well, on the one hand, it'd be great if these two nations, if the United States was 2 nations instead of 1, because we know they are going to be this huge superpower, right? But we don't want them to be too much more powerful than us. Well, they're less powerful if they're 2 separate powerful nations instead of a single huge one, right? But on the other hand, to do this, you have to support the South, which is a slave government. And the British are staunch abolitionists. They had gotten rid of slavery across all their colonial possessions back in 1834. So it's a pretty difficult argument to make in Parliament. Now, people would say in Parliament, saying, well, we're not really supporting them because they're a slave nation. That's just unfortunate. And their President Lincoln has said this is a war about union, not about slavery. And so it's not really a bad thing for us to support the Confederacy. So this argument is going to go back and forth until finally one incident is going to decide this for the British. That deciding moment was the Battle of Antietam in September of 1862, right? This is going to pave the way for Abraham Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Robert E. Lee had made the decision in September of 1862 to invade Maryland, but he made it based on 3 very poor assumptions. First, he had hoped that the invasion into federal territory would actually prompt the British to immediately recognize the CSA, right, the Confederate States of America. If they did, he felt that once we're occupying Union land, then Palmerston, the Prime Minister, will go, oh, yep, that's right, we're going to go ahead and recognize them because they can take it to the Union. Second assumption he made is he hoped that the invasion would influence the midterm elections of 1862. And the third assumption that he made was that an invasion of Maryland would prompt Maryland to secede, that they really wanted to, and that just the presence of Confederate troops in Maryland would be the last little bit they need to do it. These assumptions are all wrong, and it results into a disaster. The British still weren't ready to recognize the Confederate States of America, and the result of the battle is going to make it impossible for them to recognize the Confederate States of America. The 2 sides will fight on September 17th, 1862. In the battle that's going to last only 1 day, both sides are going to suffer a total of 22,717 casualties, making it the single most bloody day of the war. But when everything was said and done, Lee had to withdraw from Maryland. He couldn't maintain himself on the field of battle. Now, on the battlefield itself, it's a draw. But in reality, it looks like a retreat. You know, he's just falling back into Virginia to his supply lines, but it looks like a retreat. So it looks like a great victory for the Union. That's why this battle will allow Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, making this no longer a war of union, but a war against slavery. And that's why the British can no longer, there's no way that the British can recognize the Confederacy, right? There was no hope of the Democrats taking control of the Senate, and only a very slim chance of them being able to take control of the Congress in these midterm elections, and the Battle of Antietam wasn't going to influence that one way or another. And the third poor assumption, well, Maryland wasn't going to succeed whether Lee was there or not. Maryland couldn't secede, because if you'll remember, Lincoln had suspended writs of habeas corpus, and all the pro-secessionists in Maryland were in jail. So these three assumptions are going to lead ultimately to a disaster, because now this great victory that Lincoln's been waiting for has happened, and he can issue the Emancipation Proclamation. And the Emancipation Proclamation is one of the most brilliant documents ever crafted, right? Lincoln is a trench lawyer. He likes to get in the trials. He's very good at understanding the nuances of law. And every word of this emancipation has significance and meaning, and it's designed to do specific things, right? Now, first of all, it's a compromise document designed to gain the support of three different groups of people, right? First of all, it's designed to make the abolitionists happy. The abolitionists had represented the core of the voting bloc that had elevated Lincoln into the presidency in the first place. And they, from the very beginning of the war, said this war needs to be about slavery. And Lincoln had pushed that off, saying, no, it needs to be about union. Well, now he's made them happy, because the Emancipation Proclamation effectively makes the war about emancipation now, right? It makes it about slavery. It's designed to shift European public opinion. Right, as I mentioned before, once the Emancipation Proclamation is issued, people in the British Parliament can no longer make the argument that, well, it's a war about union, so supporting the Confederacy isn't about supporting slavery. Yeah, now it is. And so that makes it impossible for Viscount Palmerston to influence and get recognition to the Confederate States of America. It's never going to happen at this point, which effectively means that the Confederacy ultimately can't win. The third aspect of this is it's designed to slate the fears of the border states, right? The border states, when it comes to an Emancipation Proclamation, can become really concerned, because remember, these border states, Missouri and Kentucky and Maryland and Delaware, who had not seceded, are slave states. They have slaves. If you emancipate all the slaves, well, then what might they do? They might go ahead and secede. Maybe even Maryland. Maybe that'll turn enough opinion that you can't throw enough people in jail. Okay. And so what do? You exempt them from it. The Emancipation Proclamation does not include the border states. It does not include, and it also doesn't include certain parts of the Confederacy that were already under Union occupation and had already been reorganized and had accepted Union rule. Like, for example, the parish in which New Orleans resided in. They were exempt as well. Okay. So this document turns the war about slavery, and the significance of it is that, first of all, it made a Confederate victory impossible. At this point, the Confederates are not going to be able to win the war, because they're never going to get the recognition. They're never going to get that one condition of victory that they had to get help. That's never going to happen. So now all they've got left is relying on keeping the army in the field, and maybe through some miracle breaking the Union's will to fight, which has only been made stronger by this document. Secondly, the Emancipation Proclamation set the stage for the 13th Amendment. You see, it doesn't actually free any slaves, because the areas under Union control, it exempts. So it's only those areas that are still in rebellion that it's declaring slaves free. Well, you don't control that, right? Now, as you take control of it, you can emancipate them, but at the time the document's released, it freed very few, if any, slaves. And there's a historical argument about that, right? But it set the stage for the 13th Amendment, which, when ratified in December of 1865, did end slavery in the United States. The last thing that the Emancipation Proclamation did was it opened the door for the creation of African American units in the Union Army. They'll call it the U.S. Colored Troops, and it'll be organized on January 1st, 1863, when the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect. This now allowed for you to create, now it's segregated, but it allows you to create African American units to fight against the Confederacy in the Civil War. Right? The enlistment of African Americans are going to cause a lot of controversy. Matter of fact, it's going to lead to the infamous New York City draft riots, right? We had an implemented draft. Now, initially, this riot's against the draft, but in 5 days of violence, this violence escalated and shifted to just being an attack on the black portions of the city, right? 50 African Americans will be killed in the riots, most of them actually lynched, and Union troops would have to be sent to New York City to restore order. Initially, whites felt that African American soldiers were not going to be very good. It's like, well, I mean, former slaves as soldiers, that doesn't make sense. If they could fight, they wouldn't have been slaves. That is literally one of the arguments used. But they're going to prove their worth very quickly in places like Fort Wagner and Charleston Harbor and Port Hudson, right? You're going to have a large number of African Americans enlist. Over 180,000 African Americans are going to volunteer for the cause. And they're going to all serve in units. They'll have white officers. No black soldier will achieve a rank above sergeant, right? But they'll serve with great distinction. In the South, the creation of these African American units were, to them, the same as a slave insurrection. And they ascribed punishments in kind. Right? They said if you capture an African American soldier, you should treat him like an escaped slave that's attacked you, like a Nat Turner, if you will. Right? As a result of this, Lincoln's actually going to issue an executive order called retaliation, which stated that if the South commits any atrocity against a Union soldier based on his race, then he will in turn execute a Confederate prisoner of war. Another side effect of this is that up until the creation of the U.S. Colored Troops, both the Union and the Confederacy often engaged in what was called prisoner exchanges, where they would exchange large number of prisoners for each other, right? Supposedly, they were supposed to go home after that. Most of them would end up right back in the lines. Well, since the South refused to trade African prisoners back to the North stopped trading any Confederate prisoners to the South, and the result was the proliferation and growth of prisoner of war camps.